Well, thank you so much for having me here. And I think we're making history today with our first online event. I wouldn't even call it um, a virtual event because it is face to face. We're all here looking at each other and everything. We're so happy for you guys, for you being here, because all of this wouldn't make any sense if you were not here, if you hadn't chosen to be here on a Sunday and a Saturday, a whole weekend with us, following us and sharing ideas with us. So thank you all very, very much. And I'm really honored and really happy to be here. And after so many, like this is the next to last presentation. And my colleagues have talked about so many topics. And we talked about purpose and objectives and about tools and about engaging students, onboarding students, and about giving them, storytelling and game-like activities and enhancing their motivation and success, making them reach the success they so much want and need. And now Adriana has just talked about giving feedback with so many wonderful ideas for us not to get stuck on the, okay, wow, very good, excellent. So I'm very happy to be following Adriana because we are going to reflect a little on the nature of mistakes. So she has given us so many techniques and ideas. And what I propose we do is really talk a little about what mistakes are and the nature of mistakes and how we view mistakes. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, give me a second. This is my presentation, right? So what's your take on mistakes? So how do we view mistakes? Okay, and the first thing I'd like to discuss a little with you is what are mistakes? Okay, the mistakes that we talk about all the time during our classes, because mistakes are an intrinsic part of language learning and teaching. Everybody makes mistakes all the time. So the first thing I'd like to propose you do, I'd like you to think about the mistakes you have made. You don't have to share anything. You don't have to share anything. You don't have to tell us about your stories or anything. I just would like to ask you to think about a mistake or a few mistakes you have made. It doesn't have to be anything serious, something maybe you did when you were a child, when you were a teenager. Just think for a moment, okay? And think about the feelings that you have. Just a couple of seconds, okay? And then, now that you have talked about your mistakes, think about whether the feeling that you have is good. Did you think about something exciting, about something interesting that you did, or maybe a new job or a new course or a diploma or a certification? Probably not. Probably when I ask you to think about mistakes, what you think about is something negative, because that's what the word mistakes does to us. It makes us think of something negative. So this is my first point for this afternoon, okay? So if we use mistakes to describe language acquisition occurrences, we use the word mistakes to talk about something natural that's intrinsic to learning, and we use the words mistakes. This is a quote by Michael Lewis, the late Michael Lewis, the author of The Lexical Approach. The words mistakes and errors, which are traditionally associated with concepts such as wrongdoing and even sin, something even a little more serious, okay? So we talk about these words, errors and mistakes, to describe language acquisition occurrences, okay? And I'd like to make a little distinction in the English language literature between mistakes and errors, okay? Normally what we talk about is that mistakes are unsystematic, they are products of chance circumstances, and even the most fluent of speakers and us as teachers, we make mistakes all the time. And even things that we do know, we know. For example, we see very fluent speakers mistaking he for she. Even Brazilian speakers, and we have ele, ela in Portuguese, for some reason people do say that, okay? And this does not mean that there's no learning or that something has not been internalized, okay? So in the literature, we call these events mistakes, and errors normally are systematic. They show we have a pattern, and we show that the student or whoever is speaking has not internalized this pattern or feature of English. Now, Having said that, a little word of caution. Today, in this presentation, I am not going to make a distinction between errors and mistakes. I'm going to use the word mistakes all the time because this is the word that we use in the teacher's lounge, when we talk to our students, when we talk among ourselves and our fellow professionals. We hardly ever say errors. We see them in papers, but we say mistakes all the time. So a little proviso here that I'll be talking about mistakes, whether to mean a slip or here, really we're going to be talking about errors, but we'll be calling them mistakes, okay? Just a little proviso, but we all know that there is a distinction between errors and mistakes, okay? So far so good. Let me see. Look at the chat here, okay? Okay. Yeah, Ana Paula says a mistake is just a slip, and really there's no distinction between mistake and slip. It's a slip. We make mistakes. We teachers make mistakes all the time. When we make an error, we have to go and study that point. But mistakes, like I say, and I say this to my students, your brain is working to make the whole body function. So maybe someday you have had a heavy meal, you've had a feijoada, and your body, your brain, and is sending messages to the body to digest all that heavy food. And maybe there's less room for you to reason about the language and monitor yourself. Maybe you had a very difficult night and you didn't sleep well. Maybe you have a problem. This can happen. And your attention is being given to so many other features of life, aspects of life, that maybe you make those slips / mistakes. Okay, very good. Let me here. Okay, so I am not proposing that we erase the words error and mistake from the literature. Okay, obviously, who am I to do that? We're going to be looking at and talking about errors and mistakes. But what I am proposing we do is that whenever we see the word error and mistake in the light of language occurrences, we exercise a change in our mindsets. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. That we have mistakes, we have errors. How do we as teachers look at these events? Okay. So let's look at what some authors have said about these events and what they call mistakes. Let me have a look at the chat just to see whether, okay, fantastic. All right, okay. Okay, so Salinger calls these events the learner's interlanguage. And you know, interlanguage, so I have, my first language is Portuguese. I'm a native speaker of Portuguese. So my L1 is Portuguese and my L2 is English. And this path, this journey alongside L1 to L2 is my interlanguage. So we, all of us non-native speakers, we're somewhere along this climb. And hopefully we teachers are closer to L2, but nevertheless, it is a kind of interlanguage. And what we're trying to help our students do is move along the interlanguage and get closer and closer to L2, right? So a mistake is a view on the learner's interlanguage, okay? Batstone says something similar, but in a different, he words it differently, the learner's interim hypotheses. So every time a learner makes a mistake, what we call a mistake, actually the learner has formed a hypothesis and he's trying it out. So if you learn that the regular past of verbs is ed, and the learner says, I goed, testing a hypothesis. Okay, I have a verb and I learned started and wanted and needed and stopped and worked. Why not goed, right? It's a hypothesis that I'm testing, and it's interim because I will learn there are regular and irregular verbs, and maybe the ed does not apply to all of the verbs, unfortunately, so I'll have to reformulate my hypothesis. Batstone also says something very interesting. It's very similar, but I think it's funnier. it's his best bet so far. So when the student says, I goed yesterday, so far it's his best bet. I know the verb, I know ed in the past, my best bet is goed. So far, this is my best bet. Richards and Sampson talk about partial successes, because if I'm able to use the word go, which is correct, and I'm able to remember that I have ed for the past tense, which is also correct, I have a success. It's partial because I still haven't figured out that I have to use, it is go is an irregular verb, but so far it is a partial success. Noonan goes a little beyond and he says it's essential. Not only it's a best bet and an interim hypothesis, but it's an essential feature. There's no way we can learn anything without making a mistake. So whenever we talk about learning anything, we're talking about making a mistake. So it's essential, and Rutherford says it's inevitable. It's an inevitable characteristic of learner language. And Michael Lewis again, he says it's not only inevitable, but actually welcome. And this is my point, my second point, that mistakes are welcome. They let us see, they let us open Mariazinha's and Joãozinho's brains and look inside, because language learning, nobody really knows what goes on. And when a student makes a mistake, the student is allowing me to have a photograph of what's going on at the moment, so that as a teacher I can interfere and help students the way Adriana talked so wonderfully, all those techniques. So I need my student not to refrain from making a mistake, so that I have an opportunity to interfere, to step in and help. Okay, so this is a very important point. It's not only making mistakes is not only inevitable, but it's actually welcome. We need students to make mistakes. Not that we want to force them to make mistakes, but we want them to make them feel comfortable so that they are not afraid of making mistakes, so that we can help them with all the feedback techniques that we can use to make them feel comfortable and progress and reach success. Let's have a look at the chat. Okay. Yes, it is part of life. We all make mistakes. But I think when we're speaking a different language, a second language, something happens to our identity, doesn't it? So it's so hard when you are an adult, and I'm talking here mostly about adults, older teenagers. You already, you dominate a language. You have a language and you express your thoughts, your most complex ideas and everything. Suddenly you go to a level 1 course and you're going, it's so frustrating, and your persona is you're not happy with your persona. So even though it is obviously part of life and we know it's going to happen, it is very frustrating and affects people, especially very, shyer people, or people who are more self-conscious, and people who have hierarchically they are above other people, and they suddenly they're reduced to babies, to baby talk. It's not easy. We have to acknowledge that feeling and then work on that, because what happens is students refrain from making mistakes so that they don't want to lose face, etc. So you can have instances of overproduction or instances of underproduction. So what are overproduction and underproduction? Underproduction, let's start with underproduction. Okay, learners will avoid using certain structures, certain vocabulary items. Okay, they're not going to make many mistakes. On the surface, everything looks really good, but still you're diverting from L2, because this is not how a fluent or a native speaker would use the language. Okay, so the learner's interlanguage will reflect a divergence from L2. Can you think of any examples of what students avoid using, whether they think it's too difficult or it's something so hard for them they haven't even internalized it? Let's see if you have any ideas. Okay, so I'm going to show you. For example, Brazilians do not use phrasal verbs very often. Okay, most of us, it's hard for us. We try and try, okay, because it is a mark of more upper intermediate and advanced speaking. Okay, I like C1 students will use phrasal verbs, but if you're stuck and you avoid using phrasal verbs because you never, is it off or on and up or in? I have no idea. I'm not going to use it. So on the surface, I'm going to sound correct. But if you think about native speakers, even an illiterate native speaker of English, someone who's never had any formal education, he will not make mistakes with phrasal verbs because phrasal verbs are part of the core of the language. So if that is underproduction, what could be overproduction? And one thing, it's like the two sides of the coin. One thing will reflect the other, okay? For overproduction, it's a consequence of underproduction because in order to avoid a difficult area, such as phrasal verbs, learners will use something similar superficially, but pragmatically, it's different. It's a different structure or different lexis. Can you think of what happens? And let's use the example of phrasal verbs, okay? I'm using underproduction here, so I'm underproducing phrasal verbs because I find that very difficult. And what am I going to use instead? Let's look at the chat and see. Okay. Yes, they avoid it. Oh, the present perfect. Sure, the present perfect. Okay. Yeah, so sometimes people will, communicatively, people will understand. I did it many times. If I say I did it many times. In the United States, it's even common to say that. But in some other countries like England, it will create a little noise. People will understand, but still it's a divergence from the norm, okay? So probably what they're going to do in the case of phrasal verbs, they're going to use Latin-based verbs because they're so similar to Portuguese, so easy to remember, okay? So they're going to overuse these Latin-based verbs. So I don't use phrasal verbs. It's okay on the surface, all right, but the register is a little off. So pragmatically, it's not exactly what a person, a native speaker or fluent speaker would say in that situation. So when, in this case, what happened here, I have students, my hypothetical student has avoided making mistakes and ended up making a different kind of mistake and has not given me the opportunity as a teacher to interfere, to help, to give communicative, to give feedback, okay? So you can go on like that for a long time. That's why Michael Lewis says that mistakes are not only inevitable, but they are welcome. They help us avoid this, okay? Let's see. So far, so good. Okay. Like, yes, Rafael, give up, desist. Easy, facile. Okay. Latin-based words. Very good. They will sound like the difference between beijo and ósculo, right? Sometimes. Something you understand, but something is strange. Okay. So, like James Joyce said, mistakes are the portals of discovery. So when my students, when I have engaged my students, when I have lowered their affective filters, like so many of my colleagues have been saying this past week or this past weekend, okay, I allow my students to feel free to make mistakes, and they are portals of discovery for themselves, for us, so that everybody can help and progress, okay? So there you have it. So thinking about that, what can we learn from our learners' mistakes? I'll give you a couple of seconds to see if you have any ideas. What can we learn? So we have here established that it is a good idea to make mistakes, not to force mistakes, but really create an environment where they feel secure, they trust you, they're okay, I know my teacher is here for me, and they can make the mistakes. And what can we learn from their mistakes? Okay. Yeah, we can anticipate difficulties. It like Adriana says, we have to give them a chance to make mistakes and go ahead. Okay, we can use them as a yardstick of their learning process. We can learn about their learning styles. We can visualize their generalization. They help us identify what the problem is when they see it. So it is like a kind of, if we are generous towards our learners by creating an environment where they know they're safe, it is a safe place. The classroom has to be a safe place. Then we will profit from what they allow us to see, and we will be able to all work together for our ultimate goal, which is the learner's success. Okay. And we also, Rafael says, we have evidence that learning is actually taking place, and maybe we have to improve. Okay, if it isn't taking place, maybe we as teachers said, what have I said? I'm not being clear. I have to reformulate. Or maybe, wow, okay, they made a mistake, but the mistake is more sophisticated than before. And we're going to be talking about sophisticated mistakes in a second. Okay. So thank you so much for all your ideas. So as you can see, wow, light. Okay, the light bulb is on when we are able to see the students' mistakes. We learn so much. All of this that you have said, and we are able to work so much better than when they are avoiding. We all know the students, we're getting their compositions, and we have someone who's written like four impeccable sentences at A2 level, and the student is supposed to be B1 level. Four impeccable sentences, there's no mistake. And then we have the student who risks and who tries different things and is even trying to use some B2 strategies, and he makes a mistake, and we have to point it out. But wow, doesn't that show progress? Doesn't that show that, oh, I'm making sense of the language? So sometimes if something is full of mistakes, we have to really evaluate each mistake, what it shows, what the student's trying to do. Is it a pattern that hasn't been internalized? Is the student translating from Portuguese? Is the student trying something out? All of this we should take into consideration. Okay. Okay. Yes, Carla, we notice what we have to reinforce with them. Okay. Fantastic. So we see here that mistakes, they turn on the lights in our minds. Okay. So that we can see what we can do for them. And I'm going to tell you a true story. And when I talked about a sophisticated mistake, I had this little true story. It was told me straight from the horse's mouth, firsthand. And a teacher told me this a long time ago. He was a novice teacher, and she was a little flabbergasted because the level 2 student, which is really A1, just learning the simple past, and there was a test. And right after the simple past was presented, there was this sentence to be filled in. And I, blank, wake up at 7 a.m. yesterday. What do you think the student wrote? Wild guesses here. Let's see. What do you think students wrote? Waken, waked. Many people put wake, wokes, walk. We got up, which would be okay, but it's not using the word in parentheses, waked and weighed, all kinds of things. Maybe I did wake up. So I'm going to tell you what in reality the student did write. The student wrote woke. And the teacher said, oh my goodness, walk, it doesn't even resemble wake, waked would have been maybe more obvious, but walk, this is horrible, and this is wrong. And then I looked at it and wow, no, wait a minute, look at this. By writing walk, look at everything the student has realized. First of all, okay, he knows that the verb is irregular. So this is why it's a sophisticated mistake. Had the student said or written waked, he probably would be showing us that he hadn't realized it was irregular. So woke shows something else, shows that he knows it's irregular, first thing. And I remember that lesson in our book, they learn I took a shower, I woke up, I took a shower. So probably the student was thinking, oh, take, took. So wake, woke. He was probably making a parallel between take, took and wake, woke, and trying to find a pattern, an interim hypothesis. So this mistake was showing so much learning. Someone who has just been presented to the simple past, so much learning, so much progress. I said, wow, we should celebrate this mistake. This is really a wonderful mistake because it shows a lot coming from a student who's just begun to learn the simple past. Let me have a look at the chat. Yes, they're always trying. Okay, yes, I praise the yes. Who said that? I praise the yes and blame the English language. I can see who said that. Very good. This is what I tell them, said, it's not your fault. It is the language's fault because the language is irregular. The language is irregular and you're trying out and you had a pattern. You saw take, talk. So why not wake up? Woke. Unfortunately, it is the language that is irregular. Your mind is working perfectly well. Your mistake is very intelligent. It's an intelligent mistake, but that's the way the language is. It works like that. Okay, so this is the story of woke. So what can we learn? So do I know what made my student use the form woke? I can talk to my student. I can try to do like some reverse engineering and try to understand what, okay, made my student use woke, okay? What can this word woke tell me about my student's learning progress or process? What has my student learned so far to make him use the form woke? So like I said, probably learned that there are irregular verbs and probably learned take, took, okay? And how will this knowledge allow me to better help my student? Okay, so knowing this, how can I interfere? And ta-da, more light bulbs, okay, lightening up in our minds. And I told my fellow teacher that in that case, since we could give students half points, consider the question half correct, I wouldn't have considered it correct, but I certainly wouldn't have considered it no, because it showed so much progress. So I would give him a half point. If it was worth, I don't know, 0.2, I would give him 0.1 or something, but really to acknowledge the progress, point it out, use the opportunity to teach the form, but really acknowledge the very important step that the student had taken. What about you? Would you have considered it correct? Half correct? Wrong? You don't even have to share this. Think about it, okay? How would you grade this question? Okay. Then, why correct? Well, Adriana has extensively talked about correcting in a most wonderful way. So let's just reflect a little about why correct. So if it's okay to make mistakes, if it's part of learning, why correct? Well, because feedback and subsequent instruction are now broadly viewed as fundamental to the process of language development. And it is not linear, right? You go, you have to retrace your steps, you go sideways, you go to the other side, but you're progressing. And let me tell you an interesting story that I heard at a course I was taking, a Coursera course on the bilingual brain. Very interesting course, by the way, by a professor at Houston University. And he said that there was like a study taken, carried out with doctors of different specialties. And they wanted to find out that between the age of like 20 to 50, it was a long-term study, the specialty that allowed the doctor to progress the most and the least. I don't remember the least right now, but I remember the most. Can you guess the type of doctor, the specialty, okay, the specialization that he has, that allows a doctor to progress and learn and be an expert the most between the ages of 30 and 60. Take a guess. What kind of doctor? What specialty? ER doctors, I think very good. I think it's not what the survey or the study found out, but I think ER doctors, because they will have to do something, neurologists, general practitioners, GPs, okay, psychiatric doctors. Actually, it has a lot to do with ER doctors that Alessandra, yeah, emergency doctors. It is surgeons. Because when a surgeon, and I think in ER, surgery happens all the time. In ER, if you make a mistake, the mistake is obvious. Feedback is immediate. It happens right there and then. There's blood splashing all around. You have cut into an artery that shouldn't have been cut. Okay, and you have to fix it. You have to fix it. And maybe if there's a senior doctor in the team, you will learn how to fix it. Okay, until you start learning and learning and learning and fixing and looking at your mistakes and fixing, and someone giving you feedback, and then between the ages of 30 and 60, you become, an expert doctor that really is a pundit in the profession. Okay, so feedback and subsequent instruction, very important. Give feedback in a very loving way, in a very understanding way. I'm knowing it's part of language, but yes, I give you feedback, and then I help you do it again. I give you more opportunities to use the language. Okay. Okay. So we've addressed some points here. Okay, this word mistake, what it means. Okay, what are mistakes? When students avoid mistakes, what happens? The importance of having the opportunity to look at students' mistakes, what we can learn from our students' mistakes, and why correct. So let's have a look at patterns of learner mistakes in Brazil. Okay, we're talking specifically about Brazilian students. And we're going to change the word, even though we know mistakes. We're going to be talking in the teacher's lounge. Nobody's going to say, oh, my student had 10 outcomes. We're going to say mistakes all the time, all of us. But right here, let's remember, so that we kind of ingrain that in our minds, that they are linguistic outcomes and natural. So first of all, we have L1 based outcomes that come from our native language here in Brazil, Portuguese, and L2 based outcomes, mistakes or outcomes that are intrinsic to the patterns of the language being learned, in this case, English. So let's have a look at these patterns. Let's begin with Portuguese, okay? I'm going to use Audley's taxonomy, and he talks about L1 based outcomes. There is a long list, and I have chosen a few, and all the references will be at the end, okay? And I have chosen a few that have more to do with Portuguese, okay? First of all, something that's really good. Positive transfer is an L1 based outcome because English and Portuguese are Indo-European languages. Imagine someone who speaks Arabic, who speaks Japanese, who speaks Chinese, okay, Hebrew. They'll have a harder time because the patterns are so different. Because we have a Latin-based language, and English has so much Latin, it is an Indo-European language, and it has so much Latin in the language because of 300 years of French dominance, and so many Latin words, so many French words, and the syntax, everything, lots of things that come from Latin. We can benefit from the positive transfer because there are similarities in the writing system and the syntax, which can facilitate the acquisition of the second language. So this is the good side, okay? It's a good transfer. We can see a lot there in common between the two languages. Now, let's talk about negative transfer, okay? Where we step in and we really have to help. We have divergences from norms in the target language. So I'm going to use some of the instances that were mentioned by Odlin, and let's see one by one. For example, the first L1 based outcome, straying from the norm. I used to live in a house, but actually I live in an apartment. What's going on here? This is the classic, right? Vestibular stuff. Can you tell me? Obviously, atualmente. Okay, it is a false cognate, a false friend, because it is so similar. It comes from the same root, but it took two different ways. This root took two different ways in the two languages, and obviously, actually, is atualmente. In atualmente would be currently, at the moment, nowadays, right? So it's a misinterpretation, which is a false cognate is a misinterpretation. Okay, so when learners infer something different from what a native speaker of the target language might infer due to the influence of the L1 structure. Okay, so there's another one. This is a little more sophisticated. So the first one actually was really simple, but look at this. I followed the recipe, but I substituted margarine, sorry, for butter. I can't stand margarine. And then someone would say, well, if you can't stand margarine, why did you substitute it? So what's going on here? Is this sentence illogical? Okay, replaced. Very good. Thank you, Carla. Yes. Normally what we have to, because if you say, I substituted margarine for butter, I am using margarine. Okay, I am using margarine. I am not going to use butter. So if you say you're using margarine and you can't stand margarine, it's illogical. And the native speakers say, wow, this doesn't make sense. So I think the safest thing we can do as Brazilians say, I replaced margarine with butter, and then it's obvious that I'm not going to use margarine and I'm using butter. Okay, because the substitute for is exactly the opposite in English, right? So if I substitute margarine for butter, I'm using margarine. So this sentence really doesn't make any sense, unless you're a masochist, right? That you don't like margarine, but you're going to eat the margarine anyway. So this is a case of misinterpretation. Let's see another one. Another type of L1 based outcome. I really feel saudades of her. I listen music and I like of chocolate. Three things are happening here based on Portuguese. Let's see. We have all seen students, okay, do this. Yes, Katja, pretend instead of intend would be a misinterpretation. It's a false cognate, right? Because pretend is pretender, and they don't use it as fingir, right? Exactly, okay? Exactly. So instead of I miss her, I listen to music and I like chocolate. What is going on here? The student is using, all coming from Portuguese, a substitution. I don't know I miss her, so I feel saudades. And I feel, right? I feel saudades. So I feel saudades because I don't know miss. I really feel saudades. I listen music because eu ouço música, eu escuto música, right? And I like chocolate. Because we say I gosto de chocolate. So this is all coming from Portuguese, and it could be an omission, an addition, or substitution, because I try to parallel the structure of Portuguese. Okay, let me see this. Let's see the chat here. Yes, thinking Portuguese, translating it to English. Okay, so coming straight from L1. Different category. Let's see. I didn't do my homework because it didn't give, teacher, didn't give. These are true examples. On Sunday, I ate chicken to little bird. And I like very much Netflix. What's going on here? L1 interference, and they are called, oops, sorry. Let me go back. And they're called calques, because it's like decalcar, right? I am using exactly a structure here, and normally also an idiomatic structure from Portuguese into English, and sometimes the syntax in the case of I like very much Netflix, which is a really common mistake, because in Portuguese I can say eu gosto muito de Netflix, eu gosto de Netflix demais. It doesn't really matter, it doesn't make any difference, but in English you cannot say I like very much something. I have to say I like something very much. And also the other two, because it didn't give and it chicken to little bird. One is like an expression, não deu, right? And the other is the name of a dish, frango a passarinho, and it translated it word by word, like really copying, okay, the structure. Lots of things in the chat. Let me see. Okay. Oh, Diana says, yesterday, a student of mine said she didn't appear, so she gave him a cake, right? Deu bolo, or stood him up, right? Okay, very good. I gave him a cake. Fantastic. All right. So this is another category. And finally, the last one coming from Portuguese. And after this presentation, Augusto is going to talk extensively about pronunciation. You really shouldn't miss his presentation. It's amazing. Okay, just really brushing up on pronunciation here. When I say, or a student says, happy birthday, or you could play the game, or I like pizza. What's going on here? What kind of interference is that? What's happening? And this is a kind of very intelligent mistake, by the way. This shows a lot of progress when students make this kind of mistake. The student is, let me look at the chat. Let's see if I see. Marilyn says that her students say in relation. Oh, that's a lot of in relation. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay, very good. So here, what's happening is overreaction to observed L1 influence. So this is a sophisticated mistake. The student has noticed that, oh, English works like this. I am observing the language, and I am observing that I make some mistakes, and I'm trying to avoid the mistake. So in the first case, oh, I say sitty and worky and stoppy. And I see, oh, people say sit and work and stop. And my teacher has corrected me. So it's not happy birthday, it must be happy birthday, right? A cough break, the sit of São Paulo. This is a typical mistake that shows progress, that shows a step ahead. And it is hypercorrection. And again, it needs to be, the hypothesis needs to be, okay, reframed, but it's a typical mistake, someone who has observed a pattern, okay? Another mistake like this is when people say Japan, hotel, and Brazil. And they have noticed that often English puts the tonic syllable is the first one. And they say that in Japan, it is a pattern in English for when you have a 2-word or 3-word syllable, the 2-word syllable, you normally have it on the first syllable. So when it on the last syllable, on the second syllable, they find it a little strange. Maybe I'm saying it wrong. Maybe it's similar to Portuguese. It shouldn't be Japan, hotel, Brazil. No, it has to be Japan, hotel, and Brazil. So it is hypercorrection. The student thinks it is an influence from Portuguese. You could play the game. The student knows he's trying not to say could. And then he's trying to stop at the stop consonant. But it's so difficult. So a little schwa gets in the way. And it takes a long time for the student to be able to stop at the stop consonant and not use the schwa. I should, and I could, yeah. And he did. So it's in order not to say kuji, shuji, and diji, the little schwa gets in the way. So it's hypercorrection. And finally, I like pizza. So many times the student has noticed that many words that he uses the word, the vowel E really is the short E. And then sit and city. And then shouldn't be pizza, should be pizza, okay? So again, it's observing the language, trying to understand a pattern and hypercorrecting, and the hypothesis is interim and has to be reformulated, okay? Let's look at the chat, okay? Polis, okay? Polis, very good, because we say polícia, but you don't say, okay, police. Maybe it's too similar to Portuguese, right? Should be polis on the first, with the tonic syllable is the first syllable. So very good. Have 2 cars here, which is calc. Okay, tem 2 carros aqui, really is calc. Very good. Okay. Yes, Silvia, the process is so beautiful. We fight against it. And I think we should look at it as like we're growing a garden. And we see how much sun we need, how much water we need. Is it too much sun, too much water? And understand the biological process and not blame the biological process. But if there's too much sun, too much water, we have to correct it. But never fight it and never think it's wrong. It's not wrong. It is natural. Okay. Yes, Ruchi, confortável, okay? Comfortable, comfortable instead of comfortable. Very good. I always ask my students to remember campo de futebol, comfortable, 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 okay, for them to remember. So L1 based outcomes, okay? We talked about positive transfer, we talked about negative transfer, and under negative transfer, we have misinterpretation, we have substitutions, omissions, and additions, we have calc, okay, and we have overreaction to perceived influence. So say, I think this is Portuguese, so happy birthday should be correct. So this is an overreaction. And I would say that the overreaction is the most sophisticated mistake in terms of where you are along your learning process. Let me look at the chat. Okay. Vegetables, again, vegetables, right, Adriana? Fantastic. Oops, go back. Right, now let's talk about a few. It comes from James. Okay, again, the reference will be at the end. So a few mistakes that stem from English itself. Okay, the language and the patterns of the language that the students trying to internalize. Okay, and it's not easy. We know that. Okay, look at this one here. What's going on? I'm trying to establish a pattern. If girl becomes girls in the plural, then woman becomes woman's. If take becomes took, then wake becomes woke. And if the pronunciation is future, then probably it's future. Okay, so what's going on here? Yes, Wanda, comfortable works a lot. And they laugh and they remember. Okay, it's a false analogy. And the student, again, it's a hypothesis. Again, it reads nothing less than the entering hypothesis. The learner wrongly assumes that the new item B that he's learning, like woman, the plural of woman, behaves like A, the plural of girl. Okay, so yes, again, it's not the student's fault. Blame it on the language. The language is irregular. All of this is irregularities of the language. So girls, why not woman's, right, etc. And the famous woke case, now famous, and future, why not culture, like many people say it. Okay, so it's a false analogy. It's a hypothesis that needs to be corrected, but it shows learning, it shows progress, it shows growth in the language. Okay, let's see. All right. What about here? What's going on? Where does he works? Do you know where is he? It's important to don't forget. What do you think is happening here? Why is the student producing this language? Let's see if you have any guesses here. Yes. Okay. Maybe we're comparing to English, to Portuguese, maybe, because we never know. This is a little proviso that I forgot to make when we started, that these categories are not clear cut. I have only one, only other. The whole process is very messy. They overlap, they interfere with each other. Obviously, this is really pedagogical, but this is not how the brain works. So maybe it is Portuguese, who knows, okay? Or maybe he learned here in the first case that it's a misanalysis. I know that for me to mark the third person singular, I have to use the S because I learned he works at Solep. So, okay, it's a question, where does he works? What I haven't learned is if I mark the third person with does, I don't need to mark it in the main verb. So this is something, again, interim hypothesis, okay? I have a hunch. I have a hypothesis, but they're putting it into practice. But it's in dream. It's the best bet so far, and I have to adjust my hypothesis to incorporate the fact that when I have does, I don't need the s. Same thing here. I learned the question. I learn a invert with verb to be. Where is he? Very good. Do you know? Where is he? So I have to learn that with embedded questions, if the first part is a question, the second part doesn't have to have the structure of a question anymore. So do you know where he is? And it's important to don't forget. I know the negative. Forget, don't forget. I know the imperative. Don't forget to do your homework. The teacher has said that so many times. So it's important to don't forget. What I don't know is that when I have it's important followed by an infinitive, I have to say it's important not to forget. Okay, it's important not to forget. This is more sophisticated, but they all show a lot of learning. I have learned something about the third person. I have learned something about interrogatives in English, and I have learned something about negatives in English. They show learning, and I have to adjust the hypothesis. Okay, let me look at the chat. There are 10 little things here. Okay, generalization varies. Well, okay. Okay, time to wrap up. So let's wrap up very quickly. Okay, very quickly. Enjoy to watch movies. Same thing, you need to do a decision. I can do nothing. And overlooking co-occurrence restrictions, because I have to say enjoy watching. You need to make a decision because it's a collocation. I can't do anything because I cannot use two negatives, at least in the norm is not to use two negatives. So Verusca is telling me it's time to wrap up. So last thing, I'm gonna quickly go through this. When I have the shop that I bought instead of where I bought, yesterday I work it and then I play it. Volleyball, I don't like meat of cow, but I like meat of pig. Okay, I am overgeneralizing. I know that's the shop that sells boots that I bought. Wrong. Yesterday, I know that is needed, wanted. I worked, okay, and I know meat, but I don't know beef and I don't know pork. So I say meat of cow and meat of pig. So these are, okay. So for us to wrap up, okay, we talked about what are mistakes. Errors and mistakes really are language learning occurrences. They are not only inevitable, but are welcome. What can we learn from our learners' mistakes? Why correct the patterns of learner outcomes that are L1 and L2 based? Okay. And the question, how can learners' mistakes help our students succeed? They help. So this is the question I would like you to leave with. How can the mistakes that students make actually help? They are welcome, and then they help us. How? Okay. And this is the bibliography, and you will be able to see this later. And thank you very much. And the light bulb is on for us to think about our students' mistakes and how we can help them, okay, in this natural process. Thank you very, very much indeed.